Welcome to Sidebar, a podcast by Courthouse News. I'm your host, Amanda Pampuro. We are heading into spooky season, and who better to be our guide than fellow Sidebar host, Kelsey Reichman.
Hey Amanda. By spooky season, I assume you're talking about a new Supreme Court term.
Is it a coincidence the two coincide?
The Supreme Court's spooky season seems to be never-ending, actually.
Then I'm glad you're here, because I have a ton of questions about this thing called the Shadow Docket, and how Trump has been using the in-case-of-emergency-only process to short-circuit his way to quick, tweetable victories. Later on, I want to hear from Courthouse News D.C. reporters Ryan Knappenberger and Ben Weiss to learn more about how the president's policies are impacting Congress and judicial safety. But first, tell me, what exactly is the Shadow Docket?
The infamous Shadow Docket, or emergency docket, or even interim docket, depending on your preference, has kept the High Court busy this summer, due mostly to emergency appeals from one plaintiff, the federal government. But it's not just the number of appeals that's astonishing, it's what the justices are being asked to do and how they're doing it. Donald Trump is using the Supreme Court's emergency docket to unilaterally seize power across the federal government. And no entity is more responsible for his success over the first year of his presidency than the justices.
Kelsey, you've built up the drama and high stakes for the so-called Shadow Docket. Now, would you give me an explanation of what exactly we're talking about when we talk about the Shadow Docket?
So, the Shadow Docket is kind of a nickname for the Supreme Court's emergency docket. It was originally coined by William Bode in 2015 when there were far fewer eyeballs on the docket. Steve Vladeck, another notable law professor and SCOTUS commentator, wrote a popular book titled The Shadow Docket, detailing how execution days from death penalty inmates morphed into the sprawling secondary docket that we have today. While there is significantly more attention on the emergency docket today, there's still a shadowy nature to the court's work there because it's mostly done outside of public view. On the certiorari docket, plaintiffs who lost in the lower courts submit petitions for review by the full court. This includes submitting briefs, hearing arguments, and a Supreme Court opinion, which can be in the hundreds of pages long. In contrast, the Shadow Docket consists mostly of emergency appeals or requests to temporarily block lower court orders like injunctions. Small caveat here, according to scholars like Vladeck, the Shadow Docket also includes work like denying cert petitions because the court acts outside of public view and often without explanation. Typically, emergency applications are decided without oral arguments, and most of the time the court doesn't provide justification for its actions. The justices don't even have to say publicly how they vote on an emergency appeal.
What exactly amounts to an emergency in this context?
Funny you should ask. Basically anything that the justices think is an emergency. Like anything from there is a plane full of migrants that's about to take off to a prison in El Salvador, we should block that, to I need to fire this Democratic commissioner on this regulatory board. Like it really does vary broadly. But emergency appeals like execution stays.
That's life or death, literally.
Yeah, and while those used to be dealt with in a very quick manner because of the emergency nature, as the name would suggest, a lot of these cases now are, taking weeks to decide, which is really out of the normal. Even in the past few years, we've seen them dealt with in a matter of days. The justices are taking longer now. What the reason for that is anyone's bet because they don't tell us. That could be because some justices are writing dissents now, and that takes more time. There may be opinions that were written that never get released, and that was the holdup. Maybe the justices are still deciding or debating. We really don't know. That's one of the things about the emergency docket. We don't know a lot about it.
But the court does have the power to give more information or to expand the emergency docket proceedings if it wanted to extend that kind of transparency and explanation and clarification.
You ask a question to any scholar about the Supreme Court, and the answer is, well, the Supreme Court can do whatever it wants to, pretty much. But we did see, and we have seen in recent terms, The justices will grant oral arguments occasionally. They did this in the birthright citizenship case. That case was an emergency docket case. It had oral argument, it got an opinion, but that was ultimately a decision on an injunction. I think it's fair to say that case held more weight than an order without explanation, and we certainly are seeing the justices give more justification in scenarios like that. It is not every case. And so when they decide to expand oral arguments like that, when they decide to act very quickly, because they can act quickly if they would like to, it also says something about the justices' priorities. What do they value as an emergency? What's an emergency to this Supreme Court? It definitely wasn't the criminal case against Donald Trump. The prosecutor in that case asked the Supreme Court to intervene in what would become the immunity case way before the election and give courts time to really evaluate these issues. The Supreme Court did not see an emergency there.
They did see an emergency in whether Trump would be allowed on the ballot or not, and very quickly offered clarification, unanimous clarification, that states can't keep a candidate off the ballot even if they have committed insurrection.
Exactly. Because they tell us so little, when they choose to act, how they choose to act, what they choose to do, what kind of relief they choose to grant, we can read into that.
Do we see a lot of real-world consequences, though, even in between an emergency order if it's reversed later on?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of consequences. You know, when Biden was in office, he was not allowed to enact an immigration policy, and the Supreme Court did not offer him the same relief that it has given the Trump administration in many of these cases. And then the Supreme Court ended up ruling in Biden's favor later when they heard the case on the normal docket. And so the Biden administration lost months of being able to enforce its own policy. That happens in these cases too. In the deportation cases, you know, like once somebody is deported, it is very hard to reverse that kind of decision. You know, once somebody is fired and taken off a board and the board is making decisions without them, it's really hard to reverse that kind of thing.
The first time I heard about the shadow docket was in the middle of Biden's term. Can you say a little bit about why this shadow docket is making news again and why court watchers are ringing the alarm bells?
You know, the shadow docket started getting a lot of attention a few years ago. I think in particular, it got a lot of attention during the Texas abortion case. And this is before they overturned Roe versus Wade. Texas had this law, if everyone remembers, where that essentially overturned Roe versus Wade before the Supreme Court did so. And there was this case that they decided in the middle of the night, and it became a very big deal during that term. That was also the term where there were a lot of COVID-19 cases and vaccine policies. The shadow docket really broke into the mainstream consciousness, away from the legal minds who have been concerned about this for a very long time, with those two policies because of the impact on real life people. You know, like that was something that for anyone in Texas, for women in Texas, during that time period, that case impacted their lives immediately. And this was this, immediate shift without the preparation of a Supreme Court case where it builds up for months and people are watching it and people are preparing. This was kind of an immediate policy that happened overnight without explanation. So that really got people's attention.
And at the time, that seemed to be very rare, almost unprecedented.
The shadow docket has kept up its pace, but I do think there was a cooling off period after all the criticism of the shadow docket. You could also note that when Biden was in office, he did not file as many appeals as Trump. Trump, in his second term, has filed over 24 appeals, which is an astronomical number for a federal government. During the 16 years between the George W. Bush and the Barack Obama administrations, there were 8 Supreme Court appeals from the federal government.
In total?
Yes, 8 in total.
In total, that's crazy.
In the 9 months since Trump has taken office, as of September 22nd, there have been 28 appeals.
That is more than triple.
I would expect that number to keep growing, so that might not be an accurate count when you hear this.
You mentioned that you've been tracking the different Shadow Docket wins, and I'm wondering how difficult it is to track those. Is that a lot of work?
The Supreme Court is so different. You know, it's not like the other courts. It's on its own website. So everyone can go look at individual dockets, but there's no centralized place to find that docket number. There's no like centralized docket of emergency application cases. Sometimes the Trump administration jumps the gun and they submit an emergency appeal and then later have to withdraw the emergency appeal because something happened in the lower courts that makes it moot or whatever reason. Speaking of, we just got an order.
I think I hear your email alert dinging.
Yeah, this is kind of how the Shadow Docket goes. You just get updates and things change. So it's kind of the perfect encapsulation of how the Shadow Docket has been under Donald Trump. So we just got breaking news from the Supreme Court. It won't be breaking when you hear this, but I think it gives a good idea of how we're covering this in real time, right? So the Supreme Court just basically said that Trump could fire an FTC commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission. Her name is Rebecca Slaughter. Why that's such a big deal is because there's nearly a century of precedent supporting her keeping her job, her not being able to be fired for no reason, basically. Trump wants to fire her because she is the last remaining Democratic commissioner on the FTC, even though that she has said that as the lone Democratic commissioner, she doesn't wield power to interfere with his executive agenda. And even though this 1935 case and Humphrey's executor supports her not being fired for political reasons, the Supreme Court just allowed Donald Trump to do that. It really shows you how Donald Trump is using the Supreme Court, but also how the conservative majority is allowing him to use the Supreme Court to enact his agenda.
So Trump comes into office. He wants to fire all of Joe Biden's appointees because it's his style. He wants to start off fresh slate, put in everyone who's going to do things that he wants to. But there are laws in place that prevent the president from doing that. But he does it anyway, and we get this lawsuit, Trump v. Slaughter.
Yeah, and, you know, we've had a couple before this that have really challenged Humphrey's executor. It's kind of this ruling that the conservative majority over the last decade has really chipped away at. And while they've chipped away at it, it's still in place. You know, they have not overruled it officially. It's still this longstanding landmark precedent. It was decided in 1935, so 90 years of precedent that the lower courts have faithfully followed. And it first comes up in this case that's known as Trump v. Wilcox. And it's really Trump. He's making these independent regulatory boards an arm of the presidency instead of them acting as independent regulatory boards for the federal government. It really shows how Trump intends to carry out his presidency, right? Like, he's asking the court to let him do things unilaterally. He's not asking Congress to help him do things. He's not waiting for something to play out in the courts. He's doing things by himself, and the Supreme Court is letting him.
I'm getting the impression that these decisions impact more than just the executive branch. To understand more about these larger ripple effects, Kelsey caught up with two Courthouse News reporters who live and breathe this stuff.
So while the Supreme Court's Shadow Docket actions directly respond to Trump's use of executive authority, the consequences of those actions have a broader impact. Let's bring in some Courthouse News experts, Ryan Knappenberger, our D.C. Federal Courts reporter and Justice Department sleuth, and we also have Ben Weiss, Courthouse News' Congress reporter who moonlights as a motorsports correspondent every now and then. Let's kind of start out with how you guys are each seeing Trump use his executive authority that the Supreme Court has given him on the Shadow Docket within each of your beats. Ryan, you want to go first?
I think probably the most common and direct use of his executive power in his efforts to kind of clear out a lot of Democratic appointees throughout the federal government, and particularly at these kind of independent regulatory bodies housed within the executive branch. In all these cases, the president has essentially acted like a boss to his employees and saying this kind of classic "you're fired" to all of these different officials that he has some policy problem with. The terminated officials have obviously sued in federal courts, where we kind of have seen this battle shape out over who gets to wield certain executive powers. So in all these cases, the Justice Department has argued that these officials should be removable at will of the president because they exercise certain executive powers, even when Merit Standards Protection Board and the National Labor Relations Board are more adjudicatory bodies where they, take like employment appeals and rule on them. In the government's view, as long as you exercise enough executive power, you can be removed by the president without really any chance to challenge or contest that.
Ben, these are originally Congress's powers. In the case of the FTC commissioner who was fired, Justice Kagan wrote a dissent, and she notes that Congress limited the president's authority over this regulatory board. And she specifically called out the conservative majority for using the emergency docket to, quote, transferring government authority from Congress to the president, and thus to reshape the nation's separation of powers. How are you seeing this play out on Capitol Hill?
It's certainly not the only area where the Trump administration is stepping on Congress's toes. Another thing that I think is important to mention is how the White House is encroaching on Congress's authority over the budget, the so-called power of the purse. The White House is suing to avoid having to pay out billions of dollars in foreign aid that was congressionally authorized. And to get around that, the administration has been employing this sort of creative legal strategy they say is justified under the Impoundment Control Act. And they argue under the law that they have the power to put a 45-day moratorium on congressionally appropriated funds if they make a formal request to lawmakers that they pass a rescissions measure, basically a bill that claws back that funding. Normally, Congress, which has power over setting government spending, passes such a bill, and the funds are clawed back. But Trump's rescissions request arrived on Capitol Hill less than 45 days before the end of a fiscal year, and in the middle of what has become a pitched partisan battle over the congressional budget. And so, in effect, the timing of that move allows the White House to effectively unilaterally cancel this funding without Congress being involved. And lawmakers are unlikely in the middle of this stopgap budget debacle to extend authorization of this funding or to bring it back. In this scenario, Trump has effectively steamrolled over Congress's ability to set the budgetary authority for the government.
That very appeal is on the court's shadow docket for the third time. So again, that decision is falling into the hands of the justices to be decided with very little transparency.
And another way this is happening, of course, is with the Department of Education. The Trump administration issued an executive order effectively shuttering the agency. Department of Ed was created in the 1970s by an act of Congress. So only Congress has the authority to close Department of Ed. To lawmakers' credit, they've introduced legislation that will close the agency, in effect codifying the Trump executive order. But I think you run into a problem that I think is mirrored on the federal courts, which is that it takes Congress time to pass this legislation. It needs to be debated, it needs to be marked up. And so, in effect, the Trump administration can draw down operations of the Department of Ed while Congress is working on asserting its authority over the agency and get away with sidestepping lawmakers, even though Congress is effectively going through the normal process.
And that's directly related to the shadow docket because in April, the Supreme Court allowed the Trump administration to slash the department's funding. And this was a shadow docket decision. It wasn't something that the Supreme Court debated. They did not wait for Congress to act, even though that like you said, there's legislation before them. So the Supreme Court is allowing Trump to unilaterally take these decisions. And while there's that oversight, there is the question of how long Trump follows that oversight. I think something interesting we saw early on in these Trump cases actually came up in the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. This was the Maryland father who was deported to CCOT. Abrego Garcia's case was one of the few losses for the Trump administration. I believe it was one of two currently. The justices ordered Trump to facilitate Garcia's return. From where we are now, we know that he has been returned to the US. The Trump administration is trying to deport him again. But we saw this federal courts battle play out where the lower courts were trying to figure out what facilitate meant. Does facilitate mean personally go over, put him on a plane, and bring him back to the US? Does it just mean allow him to come back to the US if he can get here? Ryan, how did you see the lower courts try to square what the Supreme Court did with reality?
Yeah, we've seen thus far a number of cases at the D.C. federal court that's sort of created this pattern of trying to respond to the Trump administration's kind of blitzkrieg in deporting random groups of United States residents. One of the first cases we saw was obviously part of Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case, where the Trump administration deported ultimately over 200 men to CCOT in El Salvador. And we saw that case quickly go up to the Supreme Court after these 200 men had already been deported, and a federal judge, Chief Judge James Boasberg in D.C., ordered the administration to return those men, to turn their active flights around and return them back to the United States. We saw the Supreme Court quickly kind of overrule Boasberg's orders.
Again, this was a shadow docket ruling. This was not a normal ruling from the court. The court intervened on the shadow docket without full briefing here.
For Boasberg and a lot of his other colleagues at DC Fed, it's kind of left this big question mark on how to really counter the administration's kind of practice of summary deportations. In more recent weeks, we've seen a pair of cases that kind of show the two sides of this coin, of the struggle. In one case where the Trump administration tried to deport a wide swath of Guatemalan children, unaccompanied minors who entered the country for asylum reasons. Over the Labor Day weekend, the administration moved to deport. There were about 600 Guatemalan children who were listed as eligible for this kind of deportation, or as the administration has called it, reunification effort. Their attorneys for 5 of the kids quickly sued in federal court, and the emergency duty judge quickly imposed a temporary restraining order at around 2 a.m. to pause the administration's loading of these kids onto planes, and then quickly set an emergency hearing, expanded that temporary restraining order to a further class of kids, and then that case was later brought to a Trump-appointed judge to fully preside over. He ultimately ruled in the kids' favor and certified their class for the 600 Guatemalan children. In a separate case, a group of 5 recent immigrants were set to be deported to Ghana. I believe they were Nigerian and Gambian citizens who they had specific, fear-based protections against their removal back to their home countries. And yet, because the administration already deported them to Ghana, the federal district judge, Tanya Chutkin, said her hands were tied, essentially, because she could not order the government to effectively order Ghana to return these men in any real way, shape, or form. So this kind of practice of leaving the question open of what facilitate really means has left federal judges kind of scrambling to act as quickly as possible before, some 200 people get deported to a random country that they are no longer from. Otherwise, we kind of see what happened in the Ghana case.
On the Trump administration side, when the lower courts rule against Trump, he is not portraying it as just an adverse ruling for his policy. He is framing these lower court judges as doing something adversarial for the federal court system. In one emergency appeal at the Supreme Court, U.S. Solicitor General John Sauer wrote, "The decision below is the latest addition to an ongoing parade of lower court decisions that have threatened the hierarchy of the federal court system created by the Constitution and Congress by disregarding or defying this court's stay orders." And he continued, "This court's orders are binding on litigants and lower courts, whether those orders span one sentence or many pages. Disregarding them, as the lower courts did here, is unacceptable." Ryan, how are you seeing the judges react to kind of the vitriol that's been projected by the administration and some of Trump's followers because of these adverse rulings?
I think the case of Judge Boasberg is kind of pretty indicative of this problem that a lot of federal judges have faced. We've kind of seen in Boasberg's case, obviously after his rulings against the administration in the CCOT deportations, the initial deportations case, the Trump administration a couple months later filed these misconduct complaints. A misconduct complaint against Boasberg is kind of escalation of the administration's attack on Boasberg in particular. Among his other colleagues, there's a similar misconduct complaint filed against federal judge Anya Reyes, who ruled against the administration in one of the early challenges against the ban on transgender service members.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and point out that I did a survey of the cases that Chief Judge Boasberg was assigned, because there was a lot of talk, especially on Capitol Hill, about this theory that Boasberg was vacuuming up all of the important Trump cases so he could rule against them. So I went through the court system and looked at the cases that he was assigned, and my conclusion was he was assigned Trump cases at about the same rate as other members of the D.C. Fed bench. So the idea from the administration and also from Congress that there are political games being played on the federal bench, especially in D.C., I think is somewhat unfounded.
While Chief Justice John Roberts initially pushed back on the administration's attempt to impeach Boasberg for an adverse ruling, the Supreme Court hasn't necessarily discouraged the idea that lower court judges are doing something wrong. In a rare opinion on an emergency order, Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh chastised the lower court for not applying the Supreme Court's order to shutter the Education Department to another appeal slashing funding for health grants at the NIH. Gorsuch wrote, "Unless we wish anarchy to prevail within the federal judicial system, a precedent of this court must be followed by the lower federal courts, no matter how misguided the judges of those courts may think it to be." Talking about judges' security, this is one area in Congress where we are seeing bipartisanship. Ben, what are lawmakers working on to assure that judges are safe while doing their jobs?
I think there has been some bipartisan support for securing judges, but as far as material steps, I think the judiciary in particular feels like Congress has not fulfilled its obligations to the best of their ability. One major setback for the judiciary has been funding. I mean, the idea that judges are under threat, judges in courthouses are under threat, has existed for many, many years. And some figures estimate that threats against judges have increased by as much as 300% in the last couple of months. So this is something that's top of mind for the judiciary. But unfortunately, and this plays into our earlier conversation about the budget, for almost the last year, the government has been funded on a stopgap budget known as a continuing resolution. It's kept funds flat at 2024 levels. For the judiciary, this is a problem because their court security program, which is obviously funded by the government, has remained flat. And the U.S. Judicial Conference, which is the policy-making body for the judiciary, has repeatedly begged Congress to allocate it more funds for judicial security. You can't have a conversation about judicial security without acknowledging the Trump administration and some Republicans' role in creating rhetoric that threatens judges. After the assassination of Charlie Kirk, President Trump's address to the nation included a line in which he said that he was going to go after people who targeted federal judges. But I think when it comes to those comments, the call is coming from inside the House.
So we in D.C. could riff all day about the Trump administration and all of its actions. But to wrap up this conversation for Sidebar listeners, what are you watching in the coming months as Trump continues to exert executive power?
In Congress, what I'm watching as we talk about the expansion of executive power and the use of the shadow docket to step on the other branches, I'm curious about where the red line is for congressional Republicans. At what point does the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader in the Senate, say, this action taken by the president, which encroaches on our constitutional authority to do government oversight, or to set the budget, or to close federal agencies that were created by acts of Congress, is a bridge too far for us, and we're going to take steps to assert our authority as a co-equal branch of government to prevent the administration from sucking up this power. Because ultimately, this is not just a question of the current White House centralizing authority around the executive, but it will become a potentially snowballing problem for Republicans if they find themselves in the minority. So the question for me as I go to Capitol Hill every day is, when are Republicans going to say, all right, enough is enough?
I think the biggest thing I'm watching is a number of still pending cases before the D.C. Circuit. Well, in the Trump v. Wilcox case, which is now fully back before the D.C. Circuit to ultimately rule on, I'm really curious to see whether they'll even decide to rule before the Supreme Court rules in the case of Rebecca Slaughter, because there's all these concerns that if the three-judge panel were to rule in the government's favor, they would essentially be rubber stamping the administration's ability, the president's ability to terminate another independent agency member that's also now before the Supreme Court in the Federal Reserve Board of Governors member, Lisa Cook. At the Trump v. Wilcox oral arguments back in May, Florence Pan, Joe Biden appointee, expressed extreme concern that if the court were to rule in the Justice Department's favor and essentially grant the president the power to kind of terminate at will any member of the executive branch who exhibits any type of executive power, they've essentially opened the door to 30 plus agencies to have essentially be directly under the control of the president. And going back to the kind of separation of power concern, it would also effectively just undermine Congress entirely.
Thank you, Ben and Ryan, for providing all this context. I hope it was also helpful for Sidebar listeners.
I do have one lingering question about what happens next. We are headed into a new Supreme Court term with cases that will determine the boundaries of our civil rights. When the court comes back, they're taking cases scrutinizing campaign finances, election rules, free speech, and of course, executive powers.
Slaughter, the emergency docket case we discussed at the beginning of the episode will feature on the court's merits docket too. The justices granted cert before judgment on Trump's appeal, meaning that they will review the merits questions at the center of the case before the lower courts do. Cert before judgment used to be exceedingly rare. According to Steve Vladeck, there wasn't a single grant of such expedited review between August 2004 and February 2019. However, this case marks the 23rd such grant since then. Emergency docket decisions are inherently preliminary. Think of them as a stopgap measure until a case has been fully litigated. Even though Trump is overwhelmingly winning on the shadow docket, that doesn't mean he's coming out on top in all the various cases against him. Shadow Docket wins can indicate what the justices might do in the future, but they're not finding that Trump is acting within his lawful authority. They're just allowing him to continue acting for now.
Thank you, Kelsey, Ryan, and Ben for helping me keep up with the Calvin Ball jurisprudence. If you like this episode, leave us a review and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Next time on Sidebar, lionized by a best-selling novel and Hollywood movie, the Birdman of Alcatraz was the most famous prisoner in America and is still remembered as a gentle, avuncular convict with a heart of gold, at least for birds. But the real Robert Stroud was far more sinister, a double murderer, a self-proclaimed pedophile, and a serial litigant. We're going to tell you about the real Robert Stroud, the one the public never knew, the one who history has almost forgotten.